Question number 9, Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Finance. Has real gross national disposable income per capita dropped in percentage terms over the last year?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Why then did Mr English, the Minister, admit on Radio New Zealand last week that incomes are dropping despite GDP growth?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, the member is misrepresenting that discussion. The fact is that in a year where dairy incomes dropped a long way, so incomes in a certain portion of the population that's dairy farming dropped a long way, it's possible that on average, that across the country, on average, incomes dropped a little bit. But that's not wages, and it turns out that if that's what I said, I was wrong.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Give you an easier one, Bill. Is it correct that GDP per capita over the last year has grown at less than half of 1%?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I don't have that. I don't have that information with me. But if the member is trying to imply that households aren't getting ahead, he is wrong, because wages and salaries income is rising substantially faster than inflation, at 2 to 3% when inflation is about 0.1%. In the farming community, incomes are down sharply.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
See if a picture helps, Bill.
Order.
Why is he satisfied?
Order. Don't need the introduction. When the member rises to his feet to ask a supplementary question, just ask it.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr
Question,
Speaker.
Grant Robertson.
Why is he satisfied with per-person growth that is far weaker than Australia, the UK, the US, Japan and many other countries?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, of course this government is, in fact, part of the key to this government's success is relentless dissatisfaction. But the member needs to bear in mind he's picked the year that's had the biggest drop in national income for decades and the sharpest rise in population. So it's not surprising that per capita incomes in that year may not have risen as fast as other years.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
So why is he claiming success for the economy when actually the growth comes from just increasing the number of people in New Zealand rather than increasing productivity?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, there he goes again. The member's back on the notion that if you take out all the things that are growing, then the economy's not growing. Well, that's true. That would be correct. If you take out the fast growth in immigration, the fast growth in tourism, the fast growth in education, the fast growth in the wine industry, the fast growth in ICT, well, no, that's enough. Then the economy's not growing.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is he aware that per capita growth over the last year was actually 0.3%, less than half of 1%? And how can he be satisfied with an economy that is not showing substantial productivity growth and only growing because of population increase?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the government's view about productivity is pretty straightforward. In the long run, that's what matters the most. The aspect of productivity growth in the economy we have the most control over is government services. 70% of all modern economies are services. Government is over half of that, and that is why we're working so hard to improve the productivity of government services. We're getting better results for the same or less money, and in the long run that will certainly boost productivity in the New Zealand economy.
Question number 10, Derek Ball.